October 28th, 1944. Camp Kearney, Nebraska. The air in the small wooden library tasted of dry paper, oiled floorboards, and the faint, sweet scent of damp wool from the children's coats. Elsbeth held the book open, her finger tracing the German text, but her attention was on the small American boy beside her, his brow furrowed in concentration as he matched the strange words to the pictures of a gingerbread house. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the window panes, a lonely sound against the vast, empty plains. A shadow fell across their table. Elsbeth looked up to see the guard, a young corporal, his expression unreadable. Instinctively, her hand moved, not quite touching the boy's shoulder, but hovering protectively. The boy froze. "It is only a story," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. On the wall, a neatly lettered sign read, "Please return all books to the front desk." The corporal simply nodded, his gaze lingering on the Grimm's fairy tale before continuing his silent patrol. Elsbeth's heart quieted its frantic rhythm. She looked at the faces around her, German prisoners and American children, sharing a quiet truce under the watchful eyes of a foreign army. We invite you to subscribe and share which country you're watching from. 6 weeks earlier, Camp Kearney. The first thing Elsbeth noticed was the dust. It was not the familiar, damp soot of Hamburg that clung to everything with a greasy persistence, but a fine, pale powder that rose from the Nebraska earth with every footstep, every gust of wind. It coated her tongue, settled in the folds of her worn coat, and hazed the immense, indifferent sky. The train journey had been a blur of rattling steel and vast, empty landscapes that seemed to stretch into eternity, a geographia of loneliness that was more intimidating than any ocean she had crossed. Now, standing in a line of weary women, she was processed with a dispassionate efficiency. Name, rank, serial number, a quick medical check, a delousing. Each step stripped away another layer of who she had been, a teacher, a daughter, a citizen, and replaced it with the stark, anonymous label of Kriegsgefangene, prisoner of war. The American soldiers were not brutal, as the propaganda had warned. They were young, methodical, and seemed almost bored by the procedure, their voices flat as they issued commands. This absence of overt cruelty was somehow more disorienting than outright hostility. It was a sterile, bureaucratic confinement. Herded toward the barracks, she surveyed her new world. It was a city of straight lines and drab colors. Long wooden buildings painted a uniform brown, separated by gravel paths, all enclosed by the predictable geometry of barbed wire. But then she saw it. Set slightly apart from the other structures was a smaller building, distinguished only by its cleaner windows and a freshly painted door. It seemed out of place, an anomaly in the landscape of utility. Inside the barracks, the air was thick with the scent of unvarnished pine and the low murmur of apprehensive German voices. Women claimed bunks, unpacked meager belongings, and began the quiet, desperate work of creating a semblance of order in the chaos. A woman named Ingrid, her face etched with a permanent scowl, muttered that the Americans were just fattening them up for slaughter. Others nodded in grim agreement. Elsbeth remained silent, her gaze drifting back toward the window, toward that strange, solitary building. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, a voice crackled over the camp's loudspeaker, first in English, then in accented German. "Attention! Work will begin on the new recreation facility tomorrow. This will include a library, available to all prisoners upon completion." A library. The word hung in the dusty air, absurd and unbelievable. Around her, the women scoffed. "A trick," Ingrid declared. "They want to fill our heads with their lies." Elsbeth felt a flicker of something she had not felt in years. Not quite hope, but a sharp, painful curiosity. It was a dangerous feeling, she knew. And yet, she could not stop looking at the little building with the clean windows, a tiny island of possibility in a sea of barbed wire. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, gnawing debate. The little building became a focal point of Elsbeth's routine. She would watch it from the dreary window of the barracks, observing as small details changed. A detail of German prisoners, men from a separate compound, were marched over under guard to install shelves. Their hammers echoed across the compound, a productive, rhythmic sound that stood in stark contrast to the oppressive silence that usually reigned. Later, she saw crates being unloaded from an American truck, stamped with the insignia of a civilian organization she vaguely recognized. "It is a cage with paper walls," Ingrid insisted one afternoon, noticing Elsbeth's fixation. "They will give you books that tell you how wicked you are, how glorious they are. Then they will watch to see who reads. It is a test." Elsbeth did not answer. Ingrid's logic was sound, forged in the bitter cynicism of war. It was far safer to expect the worst, to see traps in every gesture of kindness, and yet, the memory of her classroom in Hamburg, of the weight of a book in her hands and the scent of aging paper, was a powerful counterargument. That life felt like it belonged to another person in another century. The desire to reclaim even a fragment of that person was a physical ache. Late one afternoon, driven by an impulse she did not try to name, she took a route back from the mess hall that led her directly past the building. The work crews were gone. The low sun of the plains cast long, distorted shadows, and the air was growing cold. She paused, pretending to adjust her shoe, her heart thumping with a ridiculous, schoolgirlish fear. She crept closer to one of the windows, peering through the slight distortion in the old glass. The shelves were finished, lining the walls raw and yellow, and they were no longer empty. Stacks of books stood in colorful, uneven towers on the floor and tables, waiting to be sorted. A single American soldier, a private with glasses, was working inside. He picked up a book, held it in his hands, and with a soft cloth, gently wiped the dust from its cover. He handled it not like a piece of propaganda, but with a quiet reverence, the way a librarian or a teacher would, the way she would have. A wave of profound, unexpected homesickness washed over her. It was so intense it almost brought her to her knees. She saw it all. The faces of her students, the light slanting through her classroom window, the comforting presence of 1,000 stories waiting to be told. She backed away from the window before the soldier could look up, her breath catching in her throat. The library was real. The next morning, a notice was posted on the camp's bulletin board. The library would officially open in 1 week. The question was no longer if, but when, and whether she had the courage to cross its threshold. The day the library opened, a nervous energy settled over the women's compound. It was a tangible thing, a mixture of curiosity, scorn, and fear. That evening, Sergeant Richter assembled them in the mess hall. He was a stern, imposing man whose authority, even without a proper uniform, was unquestioned. He had been a career soldier, and he ran the German contingent of the camp with an iron will, convinced that maintaining discipline was the only way to preserve their honor. "I have seen some of you showing interest in the American library," he began, his voice low and sharp. "You will remember who you are. You are German women. You are not here to be entertained. You are here to endure. Their books, their magazines, their ideas, they are a poison gentler than gas, but no less deadly. They seek to soften your resolve, to make you forget your duty to the fatherland." He did not issue a direct order forbidding them. He was too clever for that. Instead, he planted a seed of shame, of betrayal. His words had their intended effect. The women who had been whispering excitedly now fell silent. Elsbeth felt the weight of many eyes on her. They knew she had been watching the building. The choice was now stark: to conform and remain safely within the fold of German solidarity, or to follow this inexplicable pull toward a room full of books and risk being branded a sympathizer. For 2 days, she did nothing. She went about her duties, the conflict churning inside her. On the 3rd day, a delivery from the International Red Cross arrived. Watching the distribution of letters and small packages, Elsbeth noticed the crisp official stamp on an envelope. It was a small thing, a simple emblem of a neutral organization dedicated to a code of conduct. Yet, it struck her with the force of a revelation. Systems, however fragile, still existed. Rules of civility, of humane treatment, were being followed here in the middle of nowhere. Perhaps the library was not a trap, but simply another part of that system, an adherence to a convention that decreed prisoners should not be stripped of all intellectual life. That afternoon she walked to the library. Her steps were firm, her decision made. "I am a teacher," she whispered to herself, the words a mantra against the fear. To deny a book is to deny who I am. The room was quiet, occupied by only 2 other women and the American private with glasses. The air smelled wonderfully of paper and binding glue. She approached the desk. The soldier looked up, a hint of a welcoming smile on his face. He pushed a small registration form and a pen toward her. She filled it out in neat block letters. Her hand trembled slightly as she took the offered card. It was simple, made of thick, cream-colored cardstock, with her name and number typed onto it. It felt impossibly heavy in her hand, a small rectangle of paper that held the weight of defiance, of hope, of self. As she turned to leave, she saw Sergeant Richter standing by the door, watching her. He said nothing. His face was a mask of cold disapproval. Elsbeth clutched the library card in her hand, its sharp corners digging into her palm, and walked past him without a word. Armed with the card, Elsbeth felt a renewed sense of purpose. When she pushed open the library door for the 2nd time, it was not with the tentative fear of a trespasser, but with the quiet assertion of someone who belonged. She gave a polite nod to the American private, who was busy sorting index cards in a small wooden box. Her plan was simple: find a novel, something uncontroversial, perhaps by a long-dead English author. She did not get far. As she browsed the shelves, a presence behind her made the fine hairs on her neck stand up. It was Sergeant Richter. He had followed her inside. "An impressive collection," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. He gestured toward a rack of glossy magazines near the front. Issues of Life and the Saturday Evening Post displayed vibrant covers of smiling American families and determined soldiers. "Have you come to admire the photographs of our burning cities? Or perhaps you wish to read about the latest Hollywood film?" His words were a direct challenge, spoken just loudly enough for the American librarian and the other prisoners in the room to hear. Elsbeth's face flushed. He was cornering her, forcing her to declare her intentions. If she picked up an American magazine now, she would prove him right. If she fled, she would show weakness. She turned to face him, her expression neutral. "I am simply looking for something to read, Sergeant." "Be careful what you choose to feed your mind," he warned, his eyes cold. "It is as important as the food you feed. Your body." He did not move away, but stood observing her, a silent sentinel of German discipline. Elsbeth's hands felt clammy. She moved along the shelves, acutely aware of his gaze. She passed novels by authors she'd never heard of, history books that would surely offer a biased perspective, poetry that felt too frivolous for her current state of mind. It felt like a minefield. And then she saw it. tucked away on a bottom shelf, almost as an afterthought, was a small section of foreign language books. Her eyes scanned the spines, a few in French, one in Polish, and nearly a dozen in German. Her heart gave a leap. Most were theological texts or dry philosophy, but one book stood out. It was a thick, well-worn volume with a dark green cover. Kinder- und Hausmärchen, gesammelt durch die Brüder Grimm. Household Tales, collected by the Brothers Grimm. It was perfect. It was defiantly, unimpeachably German. It was the bedrock of their folklore, the stories whispered in their nurseries for generations. It was culture, not propaganda. A feeling of quiet, clever triumph washed over her. She had found the loophole. With a steady hand, she pulled the book from the shelf. She could feel its comforting weight, smell the faint, musty scent of its old pages. She walked directly to the front desk. The book held so Richter could see the title. She placed it on the counter, next to her new library card. The American private smiled, took out a rubber stamp, and made a satisfying thump on the card inside the back cover. The ink was a deep, official purple. Elsbeth took her book. As she passed Richter on her way out, she met his gaze. He said nothing. His jaw was tight, but he could not possibly object. She had won. Captain Miller looked out his office window at the orderly rows of barracks, a faint plume of smoke rising from the mess hall chimney. On his desk, a report from the camp's mail censor noted the generally low morale among the female prisoners. Beside it lay a letter from his wife in Ohio, her cheerful words about their son's school play feeling like they came from another planet. He took a long sip of his bitter coffee. The library, his small experiment in humane compliance with the Geneva Convention, was functionally a success. Prisoners were using it, but it was a silent, solitary success contained within the wire. His lieutenant had expressed concerns that morning. "Sir, the men are talking. The folks in town, too. They hear we've built a library for the Krauts while their own sons are rationing paper for letters home. It doesn't sit right with them." Miller understood the sentiment. The war was a brutal, ugly business, and any perceived softness toward the enemy felt like a betrayal to those with loved ones in the fight. Yet, his job was not to be liked by the town. It was to run a secure and orderly camp according to the regulations of the United States Army. And the regulations encouraged intellectual and recreational activities. The problem sat with him all day, a stubborn, low-grade headache. It was the camp chaplain, a thoughtful man named Peters, who offered a solution. "They see the library as a luxury, a reward," Peters said, settling into the chair opposite Miller's desk. "We need to reframe it, make it an activity, something that contributes, even in a small way." He leaned forward. "What if we invited the town's children to the library on Saturday afternoons for a story hour?" One of the German women, the former teacher, could read to them from that Grimm's book she checked out. It's controlled, supervised, and it builds a bridge instead of a wall. It's hard to hate people who are reading stories to your children. The idea was audacious. The risks were enormous. A security breach, a parent's complaint, a negative story in the Kearney paper, any of it could land squarely on his career. He imagined the report he would have to write if something went wrong. But then he looked again at the letter from his wife, at the childish drawing of a smiling stick figure his son had included at the bottom. He was fighting a war to preserve a world where children could be safe, where decency mattered. If he wasn't willing to take a small risk for that same decency right here, what was the point? "Do it," Miller said, the decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. "Post a notice in town and find out if the prisoner, Elsbeth, is willing to volunteer." That afternoon, a new notice went up on the camp bulletin board. typewritten in both English and German. It requested a volunteer to read fairy tales to local children on Saturday. Every woman who read it knew there was only one person with the right book and the right background. The question now hung in the air, waiting for Elsbeth. To refuse the request would have been an act of cowardice. To accept felt like an act of treason. Elsbeth wrestled with the choice for a day before giving her reluctant consent. She was a teacher. Reading to children was not a political statement. It was a fundamental part of her being, a muscle memory she could not ignore. But as Saturday afternoon approached, a cold dread settled in her stomach. The library was unnaturally clean, the floor swept and the windows wiped until they gleamed. A small circle of chairs had been arranged in the center of the room. Captain Miller stood by the door with the chaplain, their faces betraying their anxiety. About a dozen children, ranging from 5 to 10 years old, were ushered in by a few wary mothers who lingered near the entrance, arms crossed. The children were silent, their eyes wide as they stared at Elsbeth and the other German women who had gathered in the corners of the room to watch, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and disdain. The air was thick with unspoken questions, with the inherited mistrust of nations at war. Elsbeth sat down, the heavy Grimm's volume feeling alien in her trembling hands. She looked at the small, scrubbed faces before her. They were not the faces of the enemy. They were simply children, fidgeting in their Sunday clothes. She cleared her throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. "Guten Tag," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Today, we will read the story of Hansel and Gretel." She opened the book. The first few sentences were stiff, the German words feeling clumsy in her mouth. She could feel every eye in the room on her, judging, waiting. But then, as the familiar path of the story unfolded, the trail of pebbles, the candy-covered house, the cunning of the desperate children, something shifted. The teacher in her took over. Her voice grew stronger, more expressive. She forgot the barbed wire outside, the uniform she was wearing, the war that had brought her here. There was only the story, a timeless vessel sailing on the sound of her voice. The children were captivated. They leaned forward, their earlier apprehension forgotten, lost in the dark woods and sugary temptations of the tale. When she finally read the last line and closed the book, the silence that returned was different. It was no longer tense but soft, filled with the lingering magic of the story. A small boy on the front chair, who couldn't have been more than 6, looked up at her, his blue eyes serious. After a moment, he spoke, the word pronounced carefully, shaped by a tongue unfamiliar with its sounds. "Danke." The word, so simple, so German, struck Elsbeth with the force of a physical blow. It was a crack in the dam of her composure. It was not the word of an enemy, but the shared currency of human gratitude. A warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so long absent she had forgotten its name. For the first time since she had stepped on American soil, she felt seen not as a number, not as a prisoner, but as a person who had just shared a story. Across the room, she saw one of the mothers smile, and behind her, even the cynical Ingrid's face had softened. The ice had not just broken, it had begun to melt. The success of the first story hour created a small, fragile bubble of goodwill. The following Saturday, even more children came, and the mothers lingered inside the library instead of by the door. Among the German women, the open hostility toward Elsbeth had softened into a grudging respect. The library was no longer just her refuge. It had become a shared, quiet space. But the bubble was destined to burst. The rupture came in the form of the Kearney Daily Hub, delivered to Captain Miller's office on a Tuesday morning. He saw it immediately, a front-page editorial with a headline that made his stomach tighten. Comfort for the captors? The article was sharp, penned with the righteous indignation of a nation at war. It spoke of local boys dying on European soil, of families sacrificing at home. While our sons and husbands face German bullets, the editor wrote, we are entertaining German prisoners with storybooks and smiles. Is this compassion or a dangerous naivety? Are we teaching our children forgiveness, or are we asking them to forget who the enemy is? The piece concluded by questioning the judgment of the camp's leadership. A copy of the paper found its way into the barracks, passed from hand to hand in grim silence. Elsbeth read the words, the cheap ink seeming to stain her fingers. A cold wave of guilt washed over her. She had been the instrument of this. Her small victory, her moment of human connection, had brought the weight of public anger down upon them all. She pictured the library being locked, the books gathering dust, the brief truce dissolving back into the harsh reality of suspicion and wire. Ingrid gave her a look that said, clear as day. I told you so. The tension in the camp became thick enough to breathe. The American guards were more reserved, their faces unsmiling. The next story hour was scheduled in 3 days, and no one knew if it would happen. Then, on Friday, the next edition of the paper arrived. Below the fold on page 2 was a small section for letters to the editor. One was signed by a Mr. Alban Johansson. Elsbeth recognized the name of the father of the little boy who had first said Danke. His letter was short and devoid of fancy language. My son is 6, he wrote. He does not understand the war. He understands that a lady read him a story about a brother and sister lost in the woods. He learned one German word, thank you. I am a farmer. I know that you cannot grow anything, be it corn or be it kindness, with a closed fist. Teaching my son to have a little decency for a person in front of him does not make him forget his uncles who are fighting overseas. It might just remind him what they are fighting for. Reading those simple, solid words felt like taking a first breath after being held underwater. It was not a politician's speech or a general's command, but the plain-spoken defense of a Nebraska farmer. It did not erase the anger of the editorial, but it stood against it, a testament that the small bridge built in the library had reached the other side. The debate was now in the open, and the fate of their Saturdays rested on which voice the world outside the wire chose to hear. The public debate in the Kearney paper had consequences. A week later, a terse message arrived from 7th Service Command Headquarters. A full camp inspection would be conducted by a Colonel Albright. Miller knew what it was. The editorial had put a spotlight on his command, and now his superiors were coming to see if his experiment in compassion had compromised his judgment. Colonel Albright arrived on a Saturday morning, a man carved from granite, his uniform immaculate, the scent of expensive cigar smoke clinging to him. He was an officer of the old school, a man for whom regulations were scripture. He moved through the camp with an air of brisk authority, his eyes missing nothing. He inspected the kitchens for cleanliness, the barracks for order, the perimeter fences for integrity. He quizzed Miller on supply logistics, guard rosters, and disciplinary procedures. His questions were precise, his expression unreadable. Miller answered every query, his own posture rigid, his mind racing. He knew the tour's route would inevitably lead them past the library around 2 o'clock, the scheduled time for the story hour. He had not canceled it. To do so would be an admission of guilt, a sign that he believed the program was indefensible. It was a gamble, and the stakes were his entire career. As they rounded the corner of the mess hall, the faint sound of children's voices could be heard. Albright paused, his head tilted. "What is that?" "The library, sir," Miller said, his heart pounding against his ribs. "The Saturday story reading is in session." Albright's eyes narrowed. The program I've been reading about in field reports and in the local paper. He walked slowly toward the small building, stopping a few yards from the window. He did not go in. He simply stood and watched. From his vantage point, Miller could see the scene inside. Elsbeth was seated in the center of a rapt circle of children. There were no guards in the room, only the watchful chaplain near the back. The scene was one of perfect order. A German prisoner held the undivided attention of 24 American children, her voice the only sound in the room. It was not a picture of fraternization or security risk. It was a picture of absolute, peaceful control. It was more effective than a dozen guards with rifles. Miller stood in silence, feeling as though he were holding his breath. He had bet everything on this simple human tableau. Albright watched for a full minute, his face betraying no emotion. Then he made a small, non-committal grunt and jotted a note in a small leather-bound book. He turned away from the window and continued his inspection tour as if nothing had happened. As he prepared to depart hours later, he gave Miller a hard, direct look. "You run a clean camp, Captain. Maintain protocol." It was not praise. It was not an endorsement. It was a carefully worded directive that left no room for error. The program could continue, but it and he were now under the microscope. He had survived, but the victory felt precarious, as fragile as a pane of glass. Winter descended upon the plains without mercy. A relentless wind swept down from the north, carrying snow that buried the world in a pristine, blinding white. The cold was a physical presence, seeping through the floorboards and rattling the window panes of the barracks. Inside the wire, life became a grim struggle against the elements and the encroaching despair. News, heavily censored but impossible to suppress entirely, trickled in. About a massive German offensive in the Ardennes forest. The brief flicker of hope for a quick end to the war was extinguished, replaced by a chilling anxiety for the men fighting in the bitter cold. Amidst this landscape of gray skies and grim news, the Saturday Story Hour became a beacon. The small library, heated by a pot-bellied stove that glowed a cheerful red, was an oasis of warmth and light. The ritual was now deeply ingrained. The children would arrive stamping snow from their boots, their cheeks pink from the cold, and settle into their circle, their breath misting in the air. For 1 hour, the war ceased to exist. Yet, for Elsbeth, the dissonance was sharper than ever. As she read tales of enchanted forests and clever peasants, her mind would drift to the real forests of Belgium, to the real peasants caught in the crossfire. The small peace she held felt fragile, almost a betrayal of the suffering of her people back home. One particularly frigid Saturday, the wind howled so fiercely it sounded like a living thing clawing at the walls. Elsbeth, lost in a story, shivered, the draft from the window cutting through her thin clothes. As she paused to turn a page, she saw movement from the corner of her eye. It was Ingrid. The woman who had once called the library a cage of paper walls walked silently toward her. Elsbeth braced herself for a whispered rebuke. Instead, Ingrid gently draped a coarse, gray wool blanket over her shoulders. She did not say a word, her face impassive, before returning to her spot. The gesture was small, mundane, yet it struck Elsbeth with profound force. It was an armistice, a quiet acknowledgement that in this room, in this moment, they were not just prisoners, but women trying to survive a winter, united by the simple need for warmth. Later that night, back in the cold barracks, Elsbeth took out her library card. She had looked at it 100 times, but now she saw it differently. The corners were soft and rounded from use. Her typed name was slightly blurred. The purple ink of the librarian's date stamp, once so sharp and official, had been applied so many times that the dates overlapped into a faded, indecipherable smudge. The card was wearing out, its sharp edges and clear declarations softened by repetition, by touch, by time. It felt, she thought, like a memory of the war itself, no longer a single, sharp trauma, but a story being worn smooth, its meaning slowly being changed by the small, human moments that had been written over it. The news came in May, on a warm spring day when the plains were vibrant with new life. The war in Europe was over. A strange quiet fell over the camp. It was not the joyous, triumphant sound of victory that Elsbeth imagined was echoing across America, but a heavy, uncertain silence. They were free, but free to go where? To return to cities of rubble, to search for ghosts, to face the shame of a defeated nation. The barbed wire that had kept them in now felt as though it were protecting them from a future they were terrified to face. The Saturday story hours had continued through the spring, but everyone knew they were living on borrowed time. On their final Saturday, the mood in the library was gentle and somber. The summer air, thick with the scent of cut grass and the drone of cicadas, drifted through the open windows. Elsbeth read the last story from the Grimm's volume, her voice steady. The children seemed to sense the finality of the moment, sitting quieter than usual. When she closed the book, the little boy, Albin Johansson's son, walked up to her. He was holding something behind his back. It was not a drawing this time, but a book. A thin volume with a blue cover. He held it out to her. On the cover were the words, "The Adventures of Tom Sawyer." "This is for you," he said, his English clear and proud. Elsbeth took the book. Her hands were trembling again, just as they had on the day she received her library card. She opened the cover. On the flyleaf, in the careful, slightly uneven printing of a child, was a message. "Thank you, from your friends in Kearney." In that moment, holding the story of an American boy, a gift from her American friends, the weight of the past years seemed to reconfigure itself. She looked from the book to her own worn, faded library card, which she kept tucked in her pocket. She had arrived a prisoner, a number, a piece of a monstrous war machine. She would leave as something else. She was a woman who had been given a book, a person who had a story to carry home. The day they left, a line of trucks waited for them, their engines rumbling. As they climbed aboard, they saw a small crowd gathered near the gate. It was the children from the story hour, with their mothers, and even a few fathers, including the farmer, Mr. Johansson. They did not cheer or jeer. They simply stood and watched, and as the trucks pulled away, a few small hands were raised in a silent wave. Years later, in a small apartment in a rebuilt Hamburg, Elsbeth would sometimes open an old wooden box filled with keepsakes. Inside, nestled amongst faded letters and official documents, was a small, cream-colored card, its ink barely legible. She would hold it in her hand, the cardstock softened by time, and remember the dust of Nebraska. She would remember that even in a world surrounded by wire and hate, a room with books, for a little while, had been a place of peace.